Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled Control and Grow, Leveraging a Marketplace Accelerator and Brand Control in Australia. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the private Q&A widget without disturbance to the program. We will try to answer these at the end of the webinar, but if a more detailed answer is needed or we run out of time, it'll be answered later via email. Lastly, if you're having technical issues, you can find answers to common technical troubles located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen, or you may submit a question via the Q&A widget. An on-demand version of the webinar will be available approximately 24 hours from now and can be accessed using the same audience link that was previously sent to you. And now I would like to turn the call over to Darren Garcia, partner with Vorys eControl.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about marketplace acceleration and brand control in Australia. Excited to talk with you about this topic today. We have some great panelists, and without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So I'm a partner at Vorys eControl, and just to define the category that we're talking about here, the concept of eControl talks about the process through which brands exert control over their online sales to ensure high-quality distribution and protect their brand equity. And Vorys eControl, where I work, is a team within a large U.S.-based law firm that has worked with more brands and manufacturers than anybody in the world of which we're aware to help them to exert control over online sales such that they can grow in the most optimal way on online marketplaces, e-commerce, and do an overall better business across their entire channel map. So Vorys eControl incorporates multidisciplinary services alongside data and technology to configure the best online sales control solutions out there. We have lawyers, data analysts, data scientists, technologists, channel management executives, investigators, again, all focused solely and exclusively on how do companies best control their online sales. And so I'll let my colleagues joining me today introduce themselves and their firms, beginning with Mark. Hannah?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Hannah Marshall, and I'm a partner at Mark Lawyers in Sydney. I specialise in competition law, advertising, and supporting e-commerce brands. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional landowners of the place from where I'm presenting to you in Sydney. Those are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. At Mark Lawyers, we specialise, as I say, in e-commerce and full-service commercial law services to a really broad range of clients. And we pride ourselves on taking a different approach to traditional lawyers in the sense that we're focused on relationship and we're not focused on time costing, and we're purpose-driven. So we see that the law should be a force for good, and we look for ways to invoke that across the full range of our practice. It's not just a bolt-on pro bono practice. It's part of how we operate with all of our clients, and it really drives excellence and seeking the really best commercial outcomes that we can for our clients. We have been working with Vorys for some time now, and we've had a heap of experience in driving e-commerce strategies to help brands protect their value in online. And from a personal perspective, I also bring knowledge of marketplaces to the board, having worked previously as an in-house lawyer in eBay. So we love working with Vorys and we love e-commerce, and we're really pleased to be here with you today. I'll hand over to Merlene.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Merlene McGregor, and I'm the General Manager of Pattern ANZ. Pattern is the premier e-commerce and multi-channel partner for brands, and we've all worked client-side, so we're in a unique position to be able to drive performance for your brand whilst understanding the broader landscape and context within how you all operate. We have over 400 employees globally in 18 locations. And our USPs within our proprietary technology and our data-driven strategies. So we deliver profitable growth for brands across a number of different e-commerce channels. This includes owned websites, so your own D2C, as well as marketplaces, including Amazon, eBay, Tmall, JD, and more. And I'm really looking forward to sharing the insights we have of specifically the Australian marketplace with you all.
Thanks, Hannah and Marlene. So as we get into this today, just a very brief overview of the agenda. We'll talk about market dynamics, including as they relate to the Australian market. We'll talk about how to leverage marketplace acceleration in Australia through Pattern and the types of services that they can provide, as well as how to optimize those growth strategies through control. Control really being a predicate to profitable growth in today's market, and we'll talk through that, as well as how a brand can effectuate these types of strategies lawfully in Australia. So as we go through, there's the Q&A. Feel free to add a question. We'll try to leave some time at the end for questions, but we do have a lot of content to get through here today for you. If we don't get to your question, we will happily follow up with you just via email and either address it there, or if a more nuanced discussion is merited, we can schedule a time to have a brief conversation following today at some point convenient for you. So how did we get here, or why this webinar and this topic? As everybody on this call likely knows, marketplaces are expanding rapidly across the world, and Australia is no exception. When we look at the Amazon age and the dynamics that it brings to bear, up until very recently, we didn't have the transparency, the relative anonymity of resellers. We didn't have pricing algorithms. We didn't have hordes of unauthorized sellers trying to sell a company's product while free riding on trade spend, on their brand equity, on those sorts of things. And all of these things combine to cause and create unprecedented retail disruption. And the academics that are all beginning to weigh in on this will tell you that unlike anything else in the history of retail, online marketplaces have upended traditional practices and have caused more disruption than anything in the history of retail. And, when Vorys eControl first started doing this type of work years ago, working with brands, and even really up to today, there's still, a lingering conception or, within companies or within brands that, somehow the marketplaces are going to conform to the way that they want to do things, or that, they'll be able to exist business as usual. And, having worked across over 500 manufacturers and brands and just watched this evolve over time, I can assure you that they will not. And that it is up to your company, as you look forward into the future, to understand how will you exist in the marketplace world. Because it very quickly becomes, notwithstanding the fact that it may still be a smaller portion of your overall revenue. We all see what's happened with COVID, and just as trends accelerate, it's going to become a bigger and bigger piece of your revenue. I don't think anybody disputes that. And as such, you need to run it profitably, and you need to run it strategically, and you need to run it holistically across your organization. And the marketplaces won't help you with this. It's really on your own brand to engage in the self-help necessary to position your company for success in this paradigm going forward. And really, it's very much a self-help exercise, and one that companies have to do if they're going to optimize both this channel as well as do a successful, profitable business that's supportive of good customers across your traditional and brick-and-mortar channels in this market. And so when we look at kind of the two components of business, or I guess there are multiple components, but for purposes of today's discussion, let's talk about e-commerce and online marketplaces through two lenses: control and growth. And as you see the flywheel slide here, this really becomes the profitability flywheel, and one is dependent really on the other. And so when we look at, in Australia, for example, through a control strategy, i.e. through selective distribution, which we'll talk about, leading to brand stability online, leading to more leverage with retailers, leading to better brick-and-mortar performance, leading to your authorized seller like Pattern being able to own the overwhelming majority of sales in the market, being able to have better marketing outcomes, better search outcomes, better growth outcomes, and really paying off in terms of ROI on all of your marketplace acceleration investments. And that flywheel will feed itself and, as I mentioned, translate into better business outcomes both online and offline. And if you were to take away one of those components, what you would see is fragmented sales, erosion of your brand, unauthorized sellers, upset retailers because they're being, traditional brick and mortar retailers because they're being disrupted by what's happening online, and really an untapped potential in the Australian market. And that holds true, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in the States, whether you're in Europe, wherever. And so as we talk through today, really the goal is for you to understand strategically how your organization can implement these types of strategies with the right expert on the growth side, with a lawful, legally compliant brand control strategy on the control side, and drive that to better business outcomes for your company. And so, we're going to talk first about marketplace acceleration, i.e. the growth side of the equation, and, really fortunate to have Pattern on. They really are truly the only e-commerce, the global e-commerce player out there. They do a phenomenal job. We have the privilege of working with many of their brands and have just seen firsthand the types of things that they're able to do, both domestically here in the States, in Europe, and Australia, and China, and a bunch of other markets. And Merlene will talk to you as executives look to the Australian market, really how to think about this and seize the massive growth opportunities that present themselves there. So, Merlene, I'll turn it over to you to talk through this next piece here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Darren. I'll just make sure that so this slide really talks to the fact that there's a $6 trillion e-commerce and marketplace opportunity globally, which is eye-watering when you start to think about those numbers. But one of the key executive dilemmas, and we've coined it, I guess, the executive dilemma, is the challenge between growth, systems, and how to accelerate revenue whilst reaching the right customers. Many of the brands that we even talked to today have the will, but they don't understand the way forward in how to stitch their systems together and how to stitch their processes together to be able to reach those customers through the channels that they want to market within. And that could be their own D2C website, or that could also be via marketplaces such as Amazon, Tmall, Walmart, eBay, Catch-all, Kogan in this marketplace. So we know that there are massive growth opportunities in both Australia and globally. So this is our own growth footprint by the end of 2020. You can see the opportunity is massive, especially in less developed and or mature marketplace regions such as Australia, which Amazon really only launched in this market 3 years ago. eBay is the biggest marketplace here in Australia. It has its own, I think, challenges and also successes in both branded shop fronts. And Kogan and Catch are also catching up very, very quickly, I think, in terms of scale and proportion. But in Australia, we saw over 800% growth last year, fueled by both the pandemic, but also the brands we work with investing heavily in what they see as a future growth accelerant for their brand, which is definitely marketplaces. Let's go to the next slide. So what we have today, or what we're seeing, is there's a real paradigm shift from brands thinking traditionally about scale distribution, which is how the majority of offline retailers would still be operating, and I think more of the traditional retailers or brands would be operating, to parlay into a limited but robust distribution model for online success. This means that brands need to be a lot more selective and stringent about their online partners and ensure that they are strategically selecting and supporting these partnerships. And I think we'll talk more about how to do that a little bit later on. One of the questions we get asked a lot about, I think, with brands is around the different marketplace models. So there's actually quite a few. There's 1P, 2P, 3P partner and hybrid. So there's quite a few. And we're known as a 3P partner, but for simplicity, these are the two most popular models, which is 1P, selling directly to Amazon, and 3P, which is your own seller account or having your own seller account. There are many pros and cons to both. Probably too much to go through today. You could probably have a whole webinar about the pros and cons to 1P versus 3P. So I'm happy to answer any questions or take any questions at the end if we've got some time for brands who are interested in learning more. But it's safe to say that both models are robust in their approach, but there are profitability considerations and control considerations for 1P to 3P, and you have a lot more control if you're down the 3P road and or you have a partner who can help you achieve your brand control goals. Okay, so we were talking about acceleration, or Darren mentioned acceleration in the flywheel. So we have our own technology or proprietary technology to help brands accelerate on marketplaces, and I'll go through those just in a little bit more detail a little bit later on, just so you can get some context about how to actually win on marketplaces while still retaining brand control. So each of these activations have its own purpose within our stack, and they're called Destiny, Shelf, Omni, and Predict, and I'll talk a little bit more though about those in detail in a moment. But we really do believe that every brand has a destiny on its marketplace, and it sounds very dramatic, but in terms of where we think brands can go, it really is about the interplay between your product's relevance to the market, the number of reviews and positive reviews that your brand can generate, and of course price, which all lead to success in e-commerce channels. So this is a graphic that we've developed. Many of the people that we talk today, or brands that we talk today, don't really understand what drives performance on marketplaces. So we've created this really simple graphic to help brands understand what can drive their performance. And I don't know how clearly you can see this screen, but we've got both e-commerce accelerators and e-commerce decelerators. E-commerce accelerators include e-commerce accelerators include elements such as having amazing content and imagery, complete buy box ownership, ongoing review management, and automated SEO and ad management. And this is something that either we can support on or you can do yourselves. But this really leads into, I think, being able to accelerate your product via marketplaces in terms of sales and performance. E-commerce decelerators include lackluster content imagery, so only having 1 to 2 images per product as opposed to having 8, which is the, I guess, the gold standard. Limited buy box control, which means that customers aren't buying from you, they're buying from potentially an unauthorized reseller where there are no guarantees or warranties in place, which also damages your brand down the track. No review management, so who's reviewing the reviews, who's actioning the reviews and responding to them. That can also lead to a drop in conversion, but also a drop in brand equity. And poor SEO and ad management. So simply just understanding what content drives performance and how brands can do that, I think, is a really important element of e-commerce and marketplace success. So, and having said all of that, as I mentioned, we have our own proprietary technology, and it's really exciting in the fact that it's growing every day. And I think the insights that we can glean for your brand, even if you just want to have a chat with, let's say, Pattern about where your brand could go on marketplaces, we're able to do a lot of robust forecasting and channel management strategy for brands today. But just to go through, I guess, each of the elements in a little bit more detail. So Destiny is designed to take the guesswork out of paid media and organic optimization. So it's automated, and we're processing over 1 million lines of data an hour to find the optimal keywords and bidding strategy for your brand. So there's no wasted budget and there's no wasted time. Predict is around supporting your marketplace presence and control. and enables you to monitor who is selling your brand where and how this may affect your actual brand performance, which is really important when having that visibility to be able to take action against unauthorized resellers on marketplaces. Shelf is our logistics and fulfillment software and works with a number of different channels. So all of you would have either ERPs or similar or stock management, internal stock management systems. So we have developed Shelf to enable you to manage your marketplace stock and product more effectively and ensure you've got the right inventory in the right place at the right time. And the last piece of the puzzle is really around those data and insights. So being able to drive, I think, competitive insights and category information on marketplaces enables you to understand, I guess, your marketplace potential, but also who your competitors are and what their strategies are to help you win and grow. So this is essentially a high-level growth plan for your brand. So, and you'll get a copy of this presentation at the end of, I believe, at the end of this hour. But really just understanding traffic drivers, conversion drivers, and how to increase your basket size or cart size is really important for brands in enabling them to accelerate. So I won't go through all of these in detail because you'll get a copy of, as I said, this presentation at the end. But just really understanding, I think, each of these elements and the amount of time and focus and data that's required to really nail each of these elements is really important in both a brand equity and revenue driving perspective. And what we do with brands is we have something called a marketplace performance score. So regardless of whether you yourself are controlling your brand on marketplaces, it's likely that your brand probably in some way, shape or form is already on Amazon or eBay or Kogan or Catch, because they will find your product anywhere. But what this marketplace performance score actually does is enables you to understand where you sit today in the market, and then everything that you need to do to be able to drive your performance harder, or drive your relevance harder, or drive your revenue harder. And if you're not actually actively on marketplaces today, and your brand is, this audit will enable you to understand what needs to be done. And I'll just really skip quite quickly through these slides, but this is our proprietary technology. So this is a predict side. And this shows you, I think what this screen shows you is essentially your brand performance against last year. Not someone's brand performance, not your brand performance, but yeah, a brand's performance against last year, the number of orders, the ACOS, the ROAS. So all the advertising metrics are here on the right-hand side, your ad spend, but also your number of impressions, and it also enables you to see globally where you're sitting and how you're sitting. There are a number of different screens or a number of different areas in relation to predict. This is the advertising section, but there is also the buy box control section, and there is the competitive section as well. So this basically scrapes a lot of Amazon data to enable you, and other website data or other marketplace data to enable you to really truly understand where you sit in the marketplace landscape, where your brand sits, and all the key actions that you need to undertake or your partner would need to undertake to drive that performance and revenue performance harder. Hopefully that gave everybody a quick snapshot, I think, in terms of the size of the opportunity, but also some of the levers that you can pull to accelerate marketplace performance.
Thanks, Marlene. And so we'll turn now to the notion of control, and just to kind of level set, you know, when you're we're a bit Amazon focused here, but same goes for eBay and Kogan or the others. But, you know, when you think about what your strategy is as an organization, do you want to sell through a 3P marketplace accelerator like a Pattern that's going to buy your stock and resell it for you, or sell directly to Amazon? In either of those instances, you know, your ability to control your brand destiny is going to be paramount to your financial performance in the channel. And so whether it's Amazon being able to own the overwhelming majority of buy box so that they're not coming back to you wanting a better deal, you're not having a ton of channel conflict, your brick and mortar retailer's upset, or a company like Pattern being able to do all of their things from a growth perspective on the 3P side, and having the ability to own the majority of buy box and really drive your brand forward. All of that really distills down to control. And so, regardless of which strategy you pursue, either it will be clear to you now or will be very quickly as you more intentionally approach this market that it's no different in Australia than it is in the States, Europe, any place else where Amazon and other marketplaces are actively operating. And so, what we're going to talk about now is the notion of brand control, and how do you essentially ensure that your products are being sold by the right seller in the right manner, in a way that's consistent with your brand values, that you're not having free riding unauthorized sellers disrupting your go-to-market strategy, and otherwise able to fully realize your strategic goals on the commercial KPI front, which oftentimes, speaking in Amazon speak, is going to be the percentage of sales controlled by your authorized seller in the channel, whether that's Pattern or 3P seller like Pattern, whether that's Amazon, whoever that is. And so as we think about e-commerce and, going back, before the rise of Amazon and whatnot came to be, unauthorized sales just weren't that big of a deal. They could not reach large audiences. Product quality problems weren't that big of a deal because people didn't leave highly visible reviews. Free riding and channel conflict weren't a significant problem. Distributors and retailers were not significantly impacted by unauthorized sales. If anything, gray market, parallel imports, and things like that may have been a bit of an annoyance to whoever was tasked within an organization of dealing with them, but otherwise not really disruptive. But as we fast forward to, online marketplace era, the Amazons and other marketplaces of the world will quickly lay visible any lack of control that you have in your distribution channels. And so, if you're a manufacturer, you're selling into distribution in Australia, and, they're selling on down to retailers and whatnot, you can bet that your products are being siphoned out of your authorized channels and placed on online marketplaces where it creates massive amounts of intra-brand competition. So you fighting yourself before you go out and actually, face your competitors in the market, which is going to erode your brand equity, your brand value, and cause you a lot of problems. And, you have countless vendors out there talking about, oh, I do enforcement on Amazon, or I do enforcement on eBay, or, I can send scary letters, or I can send this or that. But none of that works, and that's where the whole notion of whack-a-mole and all of these concepts came to bear, because the problem does not lie on online marketplaces. The problem lies below the waterline, and until organizations address those issues below the waterline, they will never be able to appropriately support and really realize the full benefit of a really thought-out online go-to-market strategy. And so what we're going to talk about today is, in Australia, how do you go about tailoring your distribution and positioning your company to have control both over authorized sellers in a lawful manner, but also how do you have a basis to stop unauthorized sales? And, in a vacuum, most companies operating in Australia, just like in any other market in the world, if they have traditional distribution models and have not put themselves in the right place foundationally, you're not really going to have any ability to control downstream resellers, nor will you have the ability to enforce against unauthorized online resellers. That's just the reality that most brands will find themselves in. And anybody that comes to you and says, oh, you don't need to do anything, let me just send some scary letters, or I have a magic takedown trick, or whatever, I would run for the hills, because those things just don't exist. But rather, you're going to have to put in place the holistic strategy in order to be able to position yourself, again, for authorized seller control and the ability to stop unauthorized sellers. If you don't, you will have a breakdown in your ability to control your distribution, which will lead to those rampant unauthorized sales, which will ultimately erode your brand. And the key takeaway here, again, is, the online marketplaces are not going to conform to the way you want to do things. They're not going to help you. I mean, let's set aside counterfeits for a minute, because they will offer some help there. But they're not going to help you control your distribution. They're not going to help you stop unauthorized sales. That is all on you, okay? And as those become a bigger and bigger problem, you know, all of a sudden it becomes strategically very important for companies to be able to do this. And so moving out of the, you know, the situation or the market dynamics more into the tactical of how can companies get control in the Australian market. And just to kind of come back to our slide here, a holistic solution is absolutely required. So how will you reach across your organization in a very commercially practical and logistically feasible manner, but nonetheless in a holistic manner, to be able to position yourself to maintain brand control in this market? And it does not, the answer does not live in or on Amazon or eBay or Kogan or any of the others, catch of the day. The answer lies below the waterline here within your own organization and your existing distribution channels. And so when we think about, you know, how you can achieve eControl, remember our definition that we started with, we really think about it in 4 primary phases: strategy, foundation, enforcement. I don't know what happened to our T there on the enforcement piece, as well as technology and data. And so, you know, which distribution strategy is right for your brand? Well, you know, really in Australia, the answer is going to lie in what's called selective distribution. And, you know, the reality is that virtually all brands can benefit in today's market from a selective distribution type model. And really what matters most is your brand's commitment. You know, we've done a number of rollouts in Australia, in Europe, of these types of models. And it works really well when the brands are committed and your customers, particularly, you know, as they understand why you're doing this and the benefits to them, will become very supportive. And, you know, interestingly, in Europe, you know, where laws are similar to, you know, not exactly on par, but similar to those in Australia in terms of what brands can do to control their distribution, you know, the European Commission is recognizing this significant shift to a selective model, because exclusive distribution and, you know, other traditional frameworks just don't work in the e-commerce age. They don't equip brands to do what brands want them to do. And so as we think about strategic considerations, you know, for your organization in terms of the best way to set this up, you know, first and foremost, you have to lead with your KPIs. So anybody that comes to you and says, oh, I'm going to talk to you about how many unauthorized sellers I've removed, or how many takedown notices I've sent, or things like that, I mean, those are largely meaningless, and that's a road to whack-a-mole. You know, we do more enforcement than probably any other group like ours in the world, and those really are irrelevant. What matters really are commercial KPIs. And getting back to, again, what is the business trying to achieve? It's going to be sales driven by your authorized seller or sellers. And that's really all that matters. Whether you have 20 other sellers or 30 other sellers or one other or no other sellers, what matters is your authorized seller able to drive and own the sales in the market? And so to do that, you know, we're going to have to evaluate existing distribution models and relationships, your market shares to ensure, as Hannah will cover off, that any activity that you do in terms of what's called exclusive dealing in Australia, essentially vertical restraints of distribution, do not have any type of negative effect on competition in the market. And then setting out the online marketplace distribution strategy that you're trying to effectuate. Are you going to lean on a pattern to drive your sales for you in the market in a turnkey way? Do you want to sell to Amazon directly? What do you want to do? Because that has to be supported at the end of the day by what you implement. And then working to get key stakeholder buy-in and alignment, which is going to be driven largely by sales, e-commerce, and then internal legal departments if you have them. And so, you know, again, when we think about those KPIs, you know, we're always preaching you have to look at it through the KPIs, not through silly kind of takedown metrics and things like that around enforcement, but how are you moving your KPIs and which are going to be most meaningful to your brand's overall success. So again, that percentage of sales able to be driven by your authorized seller will really translate so much to overall financial outcomes in terms of growth, in terms of your review scores, category ranking. Are there other things that are important, because we can line up behind all of that. And, as we get into your existing distribution models and relationships, that's an important first inquiry. What existing contracts do you have, if any? And then working out a plan for winding down your existing model, or the ability to separate out online channels and those sorts of things. But as we navigate through all of that and being able to bring along those key stakeholders with that threshold level of alignment is really where, the magic happens. And once everybody's rowing in the same direction, these things can largely be done in a way that are not disruptive to your good customers, and in fact become very supportive of your good customers. And the goal is not to come in and totally blow up your entire model, but it's really to curate those resellers, distributors, retailers, in both online, marketplace, and offline, that are committed to your brand. And so, Hannah, I'll turn it over to you to talk through, as we move through the pillars here, strategy, foundation, enforcement, technology, and data, to start talking about the necessary legal foundation in Australia to set all of this up.
Thanks, Darren. So in this path of kind of taking over control of your brand online, you've obviously thought at this stage about the opportunity in marketplaces and in e-commerce. You've worked through the strategic considerations that Darren's just taken us through. And then you come to the question about how do you actually execute that strategy in Australia. And so the first step in doing that is understanding the legal context in which you're operating. And so, in terms of identifying your distribution model and establishing the relevant distribution agreements which will underpin that, there's actually more flexibility than people think in the Australian environment. So our competition laws apply in a way which only limit agreements which substantially lessen competition. And typically, it's the case that locking down intra-brand competition won't have an overall substantial lessening of competition, because you will remain constrained by competition with the other brands in your market. And so long as that's the case, it's pretty likely that you would be able to successfully implement not only selective distribution, but other even tighter distribution models in some cases, if that's what suits your strategy and the kind of KPIs that Darren talked about. And so from a legal perspective, the things that you need to be sure of are that your model won't substantially lessen competition. And it's also worth pointing out that MAP enforcement or resale price maintenance is also not an option in Australia. And so that's something you need to be mindful of at the stage of kind of developing your relevant distribution model. But with those two things in mind, there does remain quite a lot of flexibility and opportunity to craft a distribution strategy and documents which truly reflect the outcomes that you want. And so the most common framework for that is that, the brand undertakes to sell products only to its authorised sellers, and sellers within its network are not permitted to sell to unauthorised resellers. And that's kind of the way of approaching it that we most commonly see and can be very effective. So in terms of drilling down a little further into the process for identifying how your distribution structure should look, there's a number of steps involved. I'll just kind of talk through these reasonably quickly because I'm mindful that we've got a lot of information to cover. The first point is that you need to obviously settle on your strategy and the best model that suits your product and your brand. And so the model that suits a really kind of high-end luxury bespoke product might look quite different to a model for, say, an FMCG product. So those are the kind of things to think about at the outset. You need to take a look at the market and see what's happening at the moment among your competitors and in the retail selling landscape as well, in terms of what's happening on e-commerce already, where the sellers are, on what marketplaces they're selling, to what extent are their grey market and unauthorised sellers already operating. Taking account of those things, you then feed that into what is the exact formulation of your distribution strategy that suits the Australian market, be that selective, be that something more constrained, and then you settle upon that. At that stage, you then bring in the competition law analysis to take comfort that ideally there won't be any substantial lessening of competition, or if there's a risk of that, then to see what tweaks you can make to the model by perhaps relaxing the nature of the distribution structure to reduce any negative effect on competition. The final steps are to obviously create the actual contract and then establish a process for rolling your current sellers onto your new contract structure. Your new contract structure. And so there's a number of steps involved, and it's just a matter of kind of following the process and referring everything back to the outcomes that you've already identified in your strategy that you want, and making sure that your model is fit to achieve that purpose. Then comes the part that's fun for the lawyers, perhaps less fun for the brand, but highly effective so long as you remain mindful of balancing effort and reward. And what I'm talking about now is enforcement of your distribution structure. And there's a number of stages in managing your distribution enforcement. And obviously, as the filter shows on the slide, there are those which are most useful and easiest to accomplish with the least time and expense, and that filters down towards those which are much more targeted, much less frequently used, but become more relevant as you work your way through the process in terms of protecting your brand. So the first element is really kind of data gathering and information gathering about what's going on in the market once you've implemented your selective or exclusive distribution regime. And so that's a process of identifying unauthorised sellers and products, keeping track of where they're operating, how they're operating. The second stage of the process is then using that knowledge to internally identify your source of supply and try and cut that off. And that's always going to be the easiest, quickest, cheapest way to address unauthorised sellers, is to identify the source of supply from within your authorised network and cut that off. The third step, if that second step hasn't been successful, is to assess each unauthorised seller and determine, first of all, whether they're someone with whom you'd like to do business. And if that's the case, invite them to join your network. Because again, that's going to be the easiest, friendliest, least expensive means of taking control of that seller. And so by bringing them into the fold, you have the opportunity to make sure that they're selling your products in a way that's consistent with your branding. Then we come to the legal enforcement stages. And so the next step, if this unauthorised seller isn't someone with whom you want to do business, is then to start the process of setting up the potential legal action to primarily cut off their supply, or alternatively have their listings removed from the marketplaces. And there are a few options here, which I'll talk about in a moment. Quite often it's at this stage of legal correspondence that the unauthorised seller will change their habits, change their products, move away from selling your brand. Nobody really likes dealing with lawyers. And so there is quite an opportunity at that stage to kind of massage an outcome, obviously being mindful of not overstepping the mark, but it's quite often possible to reach this stage of the enforcement process and need not go further into the stages of actual litigation. Obviously, the final step, and I would regard this as a last resort, is the strict need for actual litigation. No sensible person takes on litigation unless it's absolutely necessary. But that said, there may be environments in which there is a real value to be gained from a strategic piece of litigation, taking account of the size of the unauthorised seller with whom you're dealing and the potential message that you're sending to the broader market that can result from a successful piece of litigation. So there will be opportunities and times when that may be relevant, but, from my perspective, I'm always very mindful that litigation should not be embarked on unless there are those really persuasive business cases relating to the outcome. And once again, that ties back to those KPIs and that original strategy that you derived in terms of what looks like success for protecting your brand. In terms of the enforcement actions in Australia, oh, pardon, I've skipped ahead. Goodness gracious. In terms of the enforcement actions in Australia, there are a number of levers you can pull. As I said earlier, MAP enforcement isn't an option here, but that's not to say that there aren't other successful enforcement actions that you may conceive. So the first of them is a straight breach of contract case, and that would be against the seller within your authorised network who is supplying the unauthorised seller. And the effect of that claim is to cut off the supply to the unauthorised seller. That's obviously the easiest cause of action. Then you move to actions against the unauthorised seller. And again, these will have the effect of cutting off their supply. And so the first of these is what's called an interference with contractual relations claim. And it's a kind of tort for the legal nerds among you. And what that allows you to do is say that, well, if you're buying products from someone within my network, you're causing them to breach their contract with me. And the outcome of that is that the unauthorised seller can no longer purchase products from the seller within your network. Another option, which is reasonably unique to the Australian environment, is an action for preliminary discovery. This is a much shorter, sharper form of litigation in which all you're doing is seeking an order that the unauthorised seller discloses the identity of their supplier. And again, what that does is enable you to identify the leak within your own system so that you can assert your breach of contract claim. This potentially has a lot of use, particularly when coupled with framing of the potential interference claim, because responding to a preliminary discovery application is much more appealing to an unauthorised seller than facing an action for interference with contractual relations, which is a much bigger, more serious, complex piece of litigation to which they might have to respond. So the preliminary discovery can be a really strong prospect of achieving a shorter, easier outcome, and quite often unauthorised sellers at the stage of just the correspondence and framing of these potential actions might voluntarily agree to disclose their supplier as a means of avoiding the prospect of facing more serious litigation themselves. So those are the most substantial causes of action which will cut off the source of supply to the unauthorised seller. There are other possible causes of action which depend on the circumstances of the unauthorised seller. We've had surprising success with copyright takedowns, particularly where the unauthorised seller's supply has already been cut off and they're selling the remaining stock that's still in their hands. If they've been lazy and taken your content, taken your graphics, taken your text for their marketplace's listing, we've seen good success in having those listings removed and the seller ultimately not choosing to relist them and ideally selling, perhaps in a bricks and mortar outlet or something along those lines, which is much less damaging to your overall brand, where you want to take much greater control over marketplaces. Other cases like misleading advertising and passing off obviously depend on the circumstances and the claims that the seller's making around your products, but they're potentially on the table as well. And again, they would be ways of having the listings taken down off the marketplace's site. So as you can see, there's quite a wide range of potential actions to explore in Australia. And as I said at the outset, ultimately it's a question of matching effort to reward and continuing to reference back to the broader strategy and what success looks like for your brand so that you can tailor your enforcement action, tailor your effort and the time that you focus on that to most likely achieve the outcomes that are most meaningful for your brand. So I'll hand back over to Darren to speak a little more about diversion diagnostics and root cause mitigation, technology and data.
Thanks, Anna. No, we'll touch briefly on diversion diagnostics and root cause mitigation. So I think, again, all of this, thinking about this in a linear strategy is, okay, how do we want to go to market? Are we going to be able to do this ourselves? Do we need the expertise of an entity like a Pattern? Do you want to sell to Amazon? How are you going to optimize commercially the channel, and then how do you best protect that strategy? And, when we get into the control piece, ultimately nobody really has the time or the budget to be engaged in that whack-a-mole type enforcement indefinitely. They are open marketplaces. You're always going to have some unauthorized sellers there, but what you want to do is really get to the heart of what is happening. and what is causing this. And in a country like Australia that essentially has, a legal philosophy that welcomes essentially importation into the country, and where you really do not have, IP type claims outside of traditional, copyright infringements and trademark infringements, et cetera, but that, that aren't there to stop parallel imports or gray markets. You really need another way. And oftentimes you're going to find that it's stuff coming from the U.S., stuff coming from China, stuff coming from your other markets. And so we really want to drill down into where is the diversion source, arming you with that information so that you can make the business decision of whether there's anything that you can do to cut that off. And so really working and understanding where these sellers are getting the products from, where the leaks are in your chain, and then tightening that up through a corrective action, cutting off certain distributors, changing practices, tightening up anti-diversion language. Those sorts of things will become key to your long-term success in all of this. But this all has to operate, very holistically around the world. It's really, what is your global control strategy going to be? We just happen to be talking today about how to effectuate this in the Australian market. And so the last piece of all
Darren,
this technology...
Darren, just to interject there, I think it's also a really prescient time for brands to be thinking about this. Many brands that we talk about in the US and in the EU, where marketplaces have been for a lot longer, they're finding themselves unraveling or dealing with a much bigger issue. Whereas in this market, which is relatively, I think, nascent or immature, the issues are going to be smaller and the challenges are probably going to be less great than if brands waited, let's say, 3 to 5 years when, Amazon has just tipped $1 billion. It'll quadruple, I think, in the next 4 years. And brands will be presented with a much larger issue, I think, over time.
Okay, I agree. I mean, it's far easier to deal with the genie when it's still, largely in the bottle or hasn't fully escaped than it is to try to, come in and clean up a mess, both on the commercial side and on the control side. And so I agree with Merlene, just getting very intentional about this and knowing that if market forces are left to their own device, it's going to get away from you. There's just very powerful things lined up to wrest control of your brand away from you and to put it in the hands of others, and nobody wants that. So again, we always try to tie everything back to the KPIs, and so leveraging the technology and data to do that becomes very important. And as we think about KPIs, for example, in the Amazon channel, we generate KPI reports like this that track weekly unauthorized seller revenue, authorized seller revenue, top unauthorized 3Ps by revenue, so that you can be very precise in your enforcement. There's so many vendors out there that work in what I call the junk mail space, where they're just blasting, the low-level people, blasting letters indiscriminately, wanting to high-five with you about the fact that you had 80 resellers and they got rid of 60 of them, but they didn't get rid of the ones that were actually disrupting your strategy. And, they don't tell you how many new sellers have come in, and you really need to track it in this manner to know whether there's any ROI and you're actually pushing your intended strategy, or you're just, doing a bunch of activity that isn't really having any commercial benefit. And so the technology allows us, the data allows us to be very precise in terms of where are we devoting your enforcement resources to drive the best commercial outcomes in all of this. And that, just to sort of end where we began, to leverage an accelerator like Pattern, to leverage Vorys or somebody like us to get that eControl to drive business value, whether it's negotiating improved terms with the platform, if you're dealing direct with Amazon, increasing your profits by increasing the percentage of buy box owned by good partners like a Pattern, providing, a top 3P seller like a Pattern the highest percentage of buy box so that they can grow your brand, converting sellers purchasing from diverters to purchasing direct from you, essentially margin flipping, And then using eControl and your strategy as a differentiator when you go out and are dealing with your true competitors in the market in the eyes of distributors and retailers that you want to do business with. And so, that's really when we pull all of this together in terms of a process strategy. How do you want to go to market? What's the necessary foundation to enable your strategy? How will you enforce against those disrupting you? And then ultimately, how will you leverage that tech and data to A, guide activity, and B, demonstrate your ROI through a program in the Australian market? And so, we have a couple of minutes. There's a couple of questions here that we'll try to get to, and I'll take a couple of these. Somebody has asked, how do we frame a MAP agreement in Australia? And just to be very clear, that is not permissible in Australia. There's no resale price maintenance. There's no MAP like there is in the States or Canada. So something absolutely has to be stayed away from, and really the name of the game is how do you set the table such that really good, high-quality resellers or your authorized sellers are able to have the majority of your sales rather than telling people what price they need to sell your product for. Hannah, would you add anything to that, or does that pretty much cover it?
That pretty much covers it there, and the rules here are quite strict around resale price maintenance. But as I said, there are a lot of other levers you can structure your agreements to really be able to pull.
Protect your brand, without having to tread into things that are not lawful. There's a question, Hannah, I think probably best addressed by you. What do you mean by passing off?
Passing off is an action that's similar to a trademark infringement action, where if an advertisement for a product misrepresents the relationship between the unauthorized seller and the brand itself, that can potentially enliven a claim of passing off. So that and the misleading advertising cases really depend on the way that the seller is advertising the product, but in some cases they will provide a basis to make them stop making those representations or stop making that passing off and have the listings removed.
Right. There's a question here. Does an authorized reseller need to seek permission from you to sell your product to their resellers? And Hannah, you step in if you're the expert if you disagree with this, but I think you have freedom in how you want to structure this. Some brands really want very tight control, and so they will go to their distributors and say, look, you're free to sell to resellers, but I need to approve the reseller to make sure that they're appropriate for my brand. Others will essentially delegate that to their distributors to determine for themselves whether a customer is appropriate within the brand's selective distribution or other distribution model. So it really comes down to how much involvement do you want at the end of the day. But do you agree, Hannah, or would you view that differently?
Yeah. No, absolutely, I agree, Darren, and it's a matter of kind of setting the strategy which works for your particular kind of product. And as I said, there'll be a vast difference between a high-end luxury product versus an FMCG product where, you might also be dealing with Coles and Woolworths, which obviously throws in another whole element of complexity to structuring the distribution arrangements. But yeah, absolutely. Brands have flexibility to establish a structure which works best given all of the considerations relevant for them.
Great. And here's the last question we'll have time for. I'll get to the others via email, or one of us as appropriate will reach out. But somebody says, how do you promote global e-commerce channel control? And I think you really need to think about it in terms of 4 pillars. Okay, channel management. So how are you going to market? What controls do you have in place? What's your online go-to-market strategy? You're going to have far more control with a 3P strategy through like a pattern than you would with a 1P strategy like an Amazon in terms of where and how your products are being sold. But then also what are the terms that you have in place with your other customers around the world? Do you have the anti-diversion language in with your distributors and those sorts of things in various markets where there's a lot of outbound parallel importation into other markets? So that has to be integrate. What we've done is really develop a core set of concepts that can be modularized around the world that are best at tightening those types of things up. So affording brands the opportunity to have that channel management, and then you get into the local nuance, like we're talking about here, selective distribution in Australia and Europe, more like authorized reseller programs in the U.S., Canada, and other markets. But that's kind of pillar one. Pillar two is how will you stop unauthorized sales? Because try as you may, there's going to be unauthorized sales. And so what is the foundation necessary to stop unauthorized sellers from interfering with your intended strategy in the country, the region, whatever it is? And that's going to vary nationally or regionally depending on where you are. But the key is that you have to position yourself in each of your major markets to be able to address that. And oftentimes, there really is only one path forward. And so that's kind of what we covered off today relative to Australia. The third is going to be, what can you do, if anything, around your pricing? And if you have markets like Australia and Europe where MAP is illegal, you're going to have different levers. How are you going to market in terms of promotional strategy? What are what's your wholesale pricing like? Do you have huge retail margins with respect to your products? And what are the types of table setting things that you've engaged in? Does it just by its nature promote an arbitrage situation? If you're in regions where things like MAP and other forms of like that are permissible, you can look at other activities there. And then the final piece is just traditional brand protection. So how do you, if somebody's engaged in marketplace policy violations, doing copyrights, doing counterfeits, doing trademark, all of those sorts of things that are pretty well understood in the market. But those four things have to be implemented and executed in all of the major markets that you're doing business, and they have to be done in a way that they all work together harmoniously so that what you're doing in Australia does not thwart your European strategy or your U.S. strategy or, vice versa. So that's really how to think about that, and it's just something that, at an enterprise level in an organization has to begin being thought through. So we're over time, but I just want to say thank you to Hannah and to Merlene, both just great representatives of great organizations, for joining us on the call today, and thanks to everybody for participating. Our contact info is on the deck, and yeah, we're happy to talk at any time. Just any one of us, either Merlene on the growth side, either Hannah or me on the control side, about how your brand can look to doing better business in Australia as we go forward in this marketplace age. So thanks everybody so much, and have a good day down under, and have a good evening in the U.S. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.